this morning we're thinking about a promise, a covenant promise. It's actually not a covenant, it's a promise of a new covenant this morning. I just want to say a special welcome to you this morning. If you're new around here, particularly if church is not your natural habitat, as it were, then we want to say a special welcome. We pray and hope that you have a great time with us this morning. We've been telling some stories this morning, haven't we, of real encouragements. And for me, one of the real encouragements I've had recently is doing the Alpha course. Got Sandra and Sarah here who join me on the Alpha course each week, and we've got our last session coming up this coming Thursday. And on that Alpha course, a wonderful story, a beautiful story is told of a man called Paul Cowley. And Paul's experience was one of growing up in a very broken home. He talks about his dad, and his memory of his dad really was that his dad was not around for him growing up. He can't remember a time when he ate a single meal with his dad. His dad was a womanizer. He was someone who was a bit of a drunk and would be often out and about and not around. And so Paul, grew up really estranged from his dad. He joined the army, came out of the army, started a family, grew up in life, and got to a point where he was entirely estranged from his dad and hadn't seen him for years. Paul became a Christian. And in that moment of becoming a Christian, his life was transformed by the gospel. His eyes were open to a world that he hadn't really seen before, and his heart became soft. And one of the areas that he felt that the Spirit was at work in his life was that he needed to make peace with his dad. He needed to build a relationship again with his father. And so now, as a 40-something-year-old guy with his own family and his own house in London, he realised that he needed to find his dad, and he didn't know where he lived. And he was able to track down his dad, who was living in a pensioner's flat on his own up in Macclesfield. And so he contacts his dad and says, "Look, can we start a relationship? Can we get together?" And so he invites his dad down to come and stay with his family in London. And so he describes how his dad would come down on the train from Macclesfield, and he'd meet him at Euston Station, and he'd take him back to his home. And do you know what? For Paul, he'd experienced a real life change in his own life and in his own heart. But what he found with his dad was that was not the case. Actually, his dad would get off the train at Euston Station, and he'd be a real grump, and he'd be really, he'd be always complaining about something. And actually, he was drinking a bit more than he had. He was more lonely than he'd ever been in his life. And Paul describes in quite a moving way, really, that actually his dad had gone in quite a different direction in his life to him. And he, to be honest, found it hard work. He found it hard work having his dad around. And on one occasion, his dad had come down, and he was in his usual grump and hard work. And actually, he became really very ill, his dad. And so he found himself spending a week in hospital in London whilst he was on the visit. And that was slightly longer than he would be used to spending down in London. And Paul describes how actually it was a right pain. He'd have to go in and out visiting his dad. And it was a real relief to him when finally his dad was able to come out of hospital. And so he takes his dad back to Euston Station to get the train up to Manchester. And he sits him down in his carriage. And Paul describes this. Just as he sat his dad down in the carriage, his heart was broken for his dad. His dad had been nothing but a pain in the rear end to him. But actually in that moment, as he sat his dad down in the carriage, he just had an overwhelming sense of God's love for his dad. And in that moment, he had a bit of a crazy idea. And he decided to get off the carriage himself and go to the ticket office and buy his dad a single first-class ticket to Manchester. And he said it cost him an arm and a leg to buy his dad this. And so he goes back to his dad. He stands him up. He takes him to the first-class carriage. He sits him down. And he gets off the train and stands on the platform with his wife. And his wife kind of looks at Paul and she says, "Well, what on earth was that about? Why did you do that?" And he said, "I've got no idea. I don't know why I've done it." But he takes a look at his dad, and what does his dad do? He takes his trilby hat off. He was used to wearing these trilby hats, and he puts it on the desk in front of him, on the seat. And he finds the kind of, that button that you press to recline the seat, and this fancy leather seat. And his dad gets a newspaper and opens up the newspaper and starts reading the newspaper. And then he clicks his fingers, and someone comes and they get him a cup of tea and a biscuit. And Paul is just watching this from outside the train, looking through the window. And just in that moment, his dad looks out of the window toward him. And he just has the biggest smile on his face. He looks like the kind of, the Cheshire cat. He's caught the cream, And he was happy. And Paul describes how, his dad went off back up to Macclesfield. And that was the last time he saw his dad. 3 weeks later, his dad died of a massive heart attack. And he talks of how the grace of God was at work in him at that moment. Of actually his memory of his dad was not of all the painful, difficult experiences that he'd had. But in God's grace, his last memory of his dad was that smile as he looked out at him. Paul was someone whose heart was broken for his dad, but in a good way. His heart was moved. The Spirit of God moved in him to do something kind for his dad. And what we're going to look at this morning is a passage that's all about our hearts. I don't know if you've noticed in the Bible, but quite a lot of the Bible, in fact, most of the Bible, has been written by ex-murderers. Have you noticed that? Moses, a murderer. David, he had blood in his hands. Saul, who became Paul, he had blood in his hands, didn't he? We don't know whether he was a murderer as such, but certainly was involved in the murdering of early Christians. But these were people whose lives were turned around by God, who were going in a particular direction, and actually God got hold of them and changed their hearts. And so I just want us to do a bit of homework quickly and have a little think about the covenants. What was the first covenant that we looked at in this series? What did we look at? Do you remember? Creation, right? So if I can get this to work, there you go. Creation, Genesis chapters 1 through to 3. So that was Dave, John, if you remember right at the start, and Katie. And they spoke of how Adam and Eve were together in the garden, and that actually what they did was that they fell into sin. They sinned. They did wrong. And they found themselves tempted to eat the forbidden fruit. And, the truth is, for each one of us in our lives, we can kind of look on at that and kind of think, oh, why did they mess it all up for the rest of us? But the truth is, each of us can know, can't we, that actually we would do the same thing, because we do the same thing every day of our lives. We do wrong. And there was a sign that was given to Adam and to Eve. And I've represented this. I thought, how do I represent this? Now, you've got to be careful here, because I don't think an apple was the forbidden fruit, by the way. But, my idea here is that actually this sign was separation from God. That's what they experienced, separation. So somehow, the way my mind works, an apple that's been cut in two is separation, right? So go with me on that one, okay? That was our first covenant, though, wasn't it? And Katie pointed out that actually with that covenant came a promise from God that actually there would be a descendant of Adam and Eve who would crush the head of the snake. Do you remember that? And so a descendant of Adam and Eve would one day bring freedom for God's people and be able to deal with the separation between us and God. What was the next covenant we looked at? You remember? Noah. Yeah. So we had Noah in Genesis 9. And what we see is the earth has gone to pot. There's evil all around Noah. And he is just the one righteous man who somehow in the midst of real evil, he is saved with his closest family and the animals going 2 by 2 into the ark. And the whole earth is flooded. What was the sign that was given to Noah? Yeah, rainbow. And it's interesting, actually, if you look at that rainbow, and you think to yourselves, what have these signs got to do with this? And it seems to me that actually Jesus, of course, is the one ultimately who can deal with the separation in our lives that was caused in creation. And what about the rainbow? I mean, there's something for each of us, isn't there? That actually when it's raining and it begins to stop raining, where do we look? We look up into the sky. Why? Because that's where the rain comes from. And we're reminded as we look at the rainbow that actually God has promised never again to flood the earth. There's a physical sign in the sky that reminds us of that covenant, the covenant with Noah. And the next one, Abraham. In Genesis 12 and 17, and my dad, Julian, spoke about the covenant with Abraham being one where actually what God was seeking to do was to have his own family that would be set apart to God. That they would be people who would be given their own land and their own space to thrive and to grow and to flourish, and to be a people on earth who would represent God and his ways to the world around them. Not for their own sake, but for the sake of the world. What was the sign given to Abraham? Circumcision. Now, you can imagine my... this is a bit of a difficult one to come up with, so I came up with this one. Yeah, all the blokes cross their legs and feel a bit difficult. But what Abraham has there is poor bloke, is a sign of circumcision. And this was an outward sign on the body that was a sign of what God was doing in the lives of the Israelites at that time. And it was a sign that actually this was a people, now not just a family, but a family set apart for God, to show the world what God was like. And then, of course, we get to Moses. And this family has now become a tribe. It's become the tribe of Israel, with its own tribes, ultimately. And Moses is given what? The sign of, if you like, the Ten Commandments, tablets of stone that are there to help God's people to know how to live in the world, how to show people what God is like, how to show people what a flourishing life looks like. And if you keep the law, if you obey it, and you obey it with all your heart, what you find is you are demonstrating to the world what a life well lived looks like. And then, of course, we get to Alison speaking about David. And David, again, was someone who was in the line of kings of Israel. And what we see there is that actually God's heart for David and for all kings was that they would obey him and lead the people well into righteousness and good living. And David is given a promise there that actually from his line there would come one who would be an eternal king. And so my image there, if you like, is of a genealogy or of a king, and that there would come a person in the line of David who would be an eternal king. And so now we come this morning to Jeremiah, and particularly Jeremiah 31. There's a related verse, a cognate verse in Ezekiel 36. And the sign that is given to Jeremiah is that of a heart. That's the sign of a heart. And this would be a covenant. Now, in itself, Jeremiah was not given the covenant. He was given a promise of this new covenant, a covenant that would be one for all people and all times, inaugurated and brought in by a person. Now, in lots of different cultures, we have the idea of a heart, don't we, and what it means. And I think it's important for us to realise that actually throughout history we've had different conceptions of how the body works. What's really interesting for the Hebrews was that they had no concept, if you like, of the brain. The word brain is not a word that exists in ancient Hebrew. And so very often when they're talking about things that we would often associate with the brain, they talk about the heart. It's, for them, they did have a concept that the heart, if you like, was an organ in the chest that sustains life. But for them, it was a concept that was so much richer and deeper. The word heart is mentioned over 900 times in the Bible. 77 times alone in Proverbs, interestingly. And it occurs all over the place. And when the biblical authors talked about heart, it would often seem a bit strange to us. Because they were talking about the heart being a place of the intellectual activity of the person. And so, for example, you know with your heart. That's where you do your knowing, is in your heart. You understand and make connections with it. In the book of Proverbs, it says that wisdom dwells in the heart. Proverbs 14. The heart is where you discern between truth and error. Like Solomon does when he is king in 1 Kings 10. He has wisdom. Where is his wisdom? It's not up here. It's in here. It's in his heart. And so in the Bible, the heart is the place where you make sense of the world. It's where you feel emotions. You feel them in your heart. Do you remember the story of Hannah? And she is desperate for a child. And how is she described? She's broken-hearted. She's broken-hearted. That is where she feels the emotional pain, the emotional weight of being childless is in her heart. The heart can be depressed. The heart can be distressed. But on the flip side, the heart is also in Scripture where we experience joy. It describes in Judges 16 that you can be good of heart. You can have a heart of joy. The heart, if you like, is the centre of our being. It's who we are. And it's the place not only where physical life is generated, but it's also the place in which we make decisions and we make choices about the world. Why do I say all this? Well, Jeremiah had quite a lot to say about the heart, because that brings us to what he has to say. His thesis is that the human heart is fundamentally broken. The human heart is fundamentally broken. You may have heard it said before, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. This is what he says. My clicker stopped working. Thanks. This is what he says. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? That's what Jeremiah says. He says the heart is fundamentally broken. It's irreversibly sick. Jeremiah had watched a whole generation of people turn away from God. And as we heard Dave speak on last week in exile, what we find is Jeremiah speaking to a people in exile is that actually, these are people who'd even got to the point where they were sacrificing their own children as if that were a good thing. And it was a seemingly hopeless time. And so for Jeremiah and for Ezekiel particularly, they were saying the only hope for humanity is a renewal of the human heart. And speaking into a moment of deep failure and into exile, what they both said to the people of Israel is, what you need is not just a fresh start. You don't need to have another law to come along. The law's good enough. What you need is a transformed heart, a new heart for the law. Not to have a new one, but to have it written on your hearts. Yes, for sin to be forgiven. Yes, to be remembered no more. But actually what you need, Ezekiel says, is for God's Spirit to live within you. To have a new heart of soft flesh. And so let's read if I can. Yep. Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah says this. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors who I took by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbour to say to one another, know the Lord, because they'll all know me, from the least to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. God's diagnosis given through Jeremiah in this situation is that actually these are a people, verse 32, that have broken my covenants with them. Even though, God says, I was a husband to them. That sense that actually time and time again, the issue is not that the law is not good enough or unclear or insufficient. The issue is that the human heart resists. It forgets. It rebels. And all the covenants that we've looked at run into the same basic problem. It's not a problem with God. It's a problem of our unfaithfulness on the part of God's people. The covenant problem, if you like, is not externally with those signs. It's internally with us. Ezekiel puts it very similarly. I'll give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I'll remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I'll put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you'll live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people and I will be your God. Very, very similar theme coming across there. And together, these two prophets describe the same covenant reality. That the need is not as such for forgiveness or instruction, although of course God's people need that. It's the need for transformation at the level of the desire and the will and the identity of the people. How they think, their choices, their emotions about God. And so the new heart isn't some random spiritual upgrade, a better model than the one that's come before. What you need is something fundamentally different. The solution to the covenant crisis is a remaking of the heart. And so Jeremiah, in our passage, highlights three areas, three outcomes that he says will come with the new covenant. The first is that not only will there be obedience, but it will be obedience on the inside, internal obedience. It will be law that's written not on tablets of stone like for Moses, but law written on the hearts of the people. Not so that you're coerced to obey God, but that you want to. At the level of your will, you want to obey him. But also we'll see that they will know me, it says there. And that this will not be a covenant mediated by others. Everyone will know God. There'll be a relational intimacy with God, a closeness to him that causes you to want to work in tandem with, in partnership with God. And lastly that actually God would remember our sins no more. There would not be a need for continual sacrifice, but for decisive action on behalf of God to forgive sin once for all. And in the biggest place in the New Testament, when it's looking back at Jeremiah 31, Hebrews 8 particularly, it's quoted. This passage is quoted 3 times in Hebrews. Hebrews likes Jeremiah 31, but the biggest place, Hebrews 8, it talks very much about this being a place in which God will remember our sins no more. And so, who is it that initiates and enacts the new covenant? We come back to our diagram. How do all these covenants start to make sense? They make sense in and through the person of Jesus. That is who fulfills each of these covenants. You know, what's the problem that was dealt with, that we found in creation? It was that we were separated from God. It's only in Jesus that we find that problem of separation from God is dealt with. What was the problem we found for Noah? Well, it was one of the world is an evil place. There was one attempt there to rid the world of evil, to cleanse it with the floodwaters. And what do we find? Well, we find evil returns because the fundamental problem of the human heart has not been dealt with. Pop quiz. The answer is always Jesus, right? Who, in Revelation 5, who is wrapped in a rainbow? Jesus. So you looked at the sky. What do you see? To see the promises of God fulfilled, that actually this rain will come to an end and that God will not flood the earth again. You look up to the sky, you see a rainbow. how do you look to God's promises being fulfilled in and through us in our lives? How can we know that actually if we want a new heart, that we will receive one? How do we know that if we ask for the Spirit, we will receive it? We look to the person of Jesus. He's wrapped in a rainbow. He's the place we look in order to receive the promises of God and power through it. So I'm struggling with my clicker, but I'll get there eventually. Jesus also points to the circumcision. This is an awkward one, right? But Jesus was circumcised, right? But actually what we can celebrate is that actually that circumcision is not just an outward circumcision on the outward body, but an inward circumcision of our hearts. That's what it talks about in the prophets. Abraham was all about there being a people of God who would love and serve him. They would have a land in which to do that. Jesus was of the line of Abraham. It talks about that all the time in the New Testament. Jesus was of the line of Abraham. And he would gather around himself a new family, a family of people who would love and serve God for all time. And that, of course, finds its expression in the church. Jesus, of course, was the true Israelite who fulfilled the law. And Jesus, of course, is the true king who comes and is able to, through being an eternal king for all time, lead us in the direction of God. And it's through Jesus that each of us can know that new heart, have that new heart. That problem of the human heart that Jeremiah and Ezekiel spoke of was one in which we could find fulfillment and life in the person of Jesus. He is the one who fulfills the covenants and enacts the new promise of the new covenant. And so you can see there, Jesus is, and his cross, his resurrection, is at the centre of the Christian life. All of the Old Testament points to him. All of the New Testament looks back at him because he is the fulcrum. He is the place in which we find fulfillment of all the promises of God in and through Jesus. And that's true for each one of us too. If Jesus is at the centre of our reality, then that means that how we use our gifts is important. God's given each of us gifts. Each one of you has God-given gifts to use. How do those find best expression? By centering them on the person in the life of Jesus, by using them to serve him. Each of us have natural abilities. Each of us have resources at our use, both monetary resources and energy and time. How does that make sense? How does that find its best fulfillment? It finds it when we center our time and our energy and our resources around the person and the life of Jesus. Point them towards Jesus, and the world makes sense. So you might have noticed this is the image that is in our title slides. It's called The Creation of Adam. Has anyone seen The Creation of Adam? It's a fresco in the Sistine Chapel, right? Ruth and I went there on a 40-degree heat day, and I was there, but I kind of wasn't there, if you know what I mean. A beautiful, beautiful fresco by Michelangelo. And in many ways, it's perhaps the most famous image, isn't it, of our day. It's been countlessly imitated, and there's jokes and memes off the back of this image. In so many ways, it's a beautiful image. It's a famous one and an appreciated one. And it illustrates God the Father, supposedly, on the right there, breathing life into Adam. It's not how it happened. I don't think fingers were particularly involved in that particular thing in Scripture, but it's a beautiful painting. And one theory of the meaning of this fresco is that God's position there, if we can zoom in a little bit on the hands. There you go. God's hand is on the right-hand side here. Adam's hand is on the left. What do you notice about those two hands? They're not quite touching there. There's a whole thing around that, interestingly, yeah. But actually what you see here is that God's hand is fully outstretched. If you look at the image, God is straining toward Adam. What would you say about Adam's hand? Yeah, it's kind of not that bothered, is it? It's kind of, a bit limp. Not really particularly stretching out toward God. Adam's hand is looser. It's a bit more relaxed. Now, there's lots of interpretations, and I'm not going to claim that this is the definitive one, but I think for me the message is clear. All humanity has to do is to reach out to God, because God is there. He's waiting for each one of us. And what we see through the covenants is that it's God's action and it's our unfaithfulness. God's action and our unfaithfulness. And what God, I think, seeks to do for each one of us is he wants to draw close to us. The question for us is, do we want to draw close to him? Will we draw near to him? And even in a slightly limp way, actually here what we see is Adam reaching out to God. And actually what God asks each of us to do is to reach out to him. And as we do that, we receive the breath of God, the life of God, in and through each one of us. And so as I close, I want us just to ask these questions for reflection. Do I relate to God as distant, or as someone that I can truly know? Where is it that I recognise resistance in my own heart? Am I trying to change my behaviour without allowing God to change my heart? And where is my heart hardened to protect itself from pain? You know, I was thinking about this a bit last night, and I don't think any of us wake up in the morning and decide a good strategy for life is to harden our hearts. Do you? But actually, I think there is something of each one of us when we can recognise that our hearts have become a bit calloused, a bit hard. And often what that is a reaction. And it's entirely logical. Let's protect our hearts from any more hurt, from pain, from difficulty. And if our hearts become a little bit hard, a little bit cold, then we're a little bit protected. But actually Ezekiel, speaking prophetically to the people of his day and to us, is that actually that's not the right answer. The answer is not to harden your heart, it's to have a soft heart toward God.